10 billionaires cheaper than you. If you are a regular average person with a normal income, you are probably fascinated by the incredible lives of the ultra rich. Whenever you hear about their wealth, only one thing comes to mind. What do they do with all that money? What could someone do with $1 million? What could someone do with $10 million? But here's the thing. Some of those millionaires pretty much do nothing with their money. Some of them may even be cheaper than you. That sounds ridiculous, right? Well, stick around till the end of this video to learn just how cheap a lot of millionaires can be. Walter Haefner. Walter Haefner died in 2012, but while he was alive, he was pretty much one of the cheapest billionaires to ever live. For example, Mr. Haefner lived in the same 6-bedroom house he bought in 1948 till he died in 2012. Despite owning a very successful car importation business, Mr. Haefner still preferred his old Volkswagen Polo and drove it to work whenever he could. Although he owned a yacht and a plane, he did not use them and they were only brought to reward and encourage his employees who were doing well. So what did Mr. Haefner do with his wealth? Well, he gave a lot of it to charitable causes. David Sheridan. Almost everyone wants to be a billionaire. And people who don't want to be one typically don't end up with $1 billion in their bank account. However, there are a few times when people who don't want to be billionaires end up being one. That is precisely what happened to Mr. David Sheridan. According to him, he hated the idea of being a billionaire. To that we say, wealth is an odd thing to hate, David, but you do you. This hatred for wealth is probably why he cuts his own hair, drives a 1986 Volkswagen, and has lived in the same house since 1981. But if Mr. Sheridan hates being wealthy so much, how did he acquire his billion-dollar wealth? Well, most of that wealth is actually in Google shares. And Mr. Sheridan is a Stanford professor, so he has a pretty good source of income as well. Carl and Theo Albrecht. The Albrecht brothers co-founded the discount supermarket chain Aldi. They are worth about $50 billion and are some of the most frugal business owners ever. For example, Carl lives in one of the country's most modest neighborhoods and one of the smallest houses in that neighborhood. He also drives a 1980s Volkswagen. Imagine being a billionaire and not driving a car made in this century. I don't know about you, but if I was worth billions of dollars, I'd at least buy myself a nice little Prius and model my quiet model lifestyle with that instead. But hey, different strokes for different folks. Frederik Meijer. Good old Mr. Meijer is one of the richest men in the world, period. He is worth around $5 billion, and that is precisely the kind of wealth that can buy you anything you want. Yachts, private jets, fast cars, you name it. A person with this net worth can buy them all. But does Mr. Meijer buy them all? Nope, far from it. In fact, this frugal tycoon even has a habit of staying at budget hotels when he is on the road. The billionaire owes his fortune to Meijer Thrifty Acres, a supercenter chain that operates throughout the Midwest. And he makes sure to take full advantage of that by only wearing inexpensive suits taken from the racks of his store. He also does not buy fancy fast cars. Instead, he goes for sturdy ones with high gas mileage. But why does a man of Mr. Meijer's means behave like a poster boy for austerity? Well, it may have a little to do with how he was born and raised. He was raised during the Great Depression by a barber father with very little to their names. Growing up in that era of extreme poverty is probably one of the reasons he is cheaper than you. Chuck Feeney. Mr. Meijer is not the only billionaire that the Great Depression made austere. Another Depression-era raised billionaire is Chuck Feeney, the billionaire who co-founded Duty Free Shoppers. According to Mr. Feeney, he did not set out to be rich. Instead, he set out to work hard. This means getting rich was exactly a coincidence for Mr. Feeney. Despite amassing a personal wealth of over $8 billion in his life, Mr. Feeney does not own a car or a house. He even rides the subway when he has somewhere to be. He is only worth about $1.5 million today. So what happened to all of Mr. Feeney's wealth? Well, that is the thing. He simply gave all the money away to disadvantaged children and public health initiatives anonymously. His identity as an anonymous donor of billions of dollars was only revealed in the 90s after a business dispute. When asked why he gave all his money away and bought almost nothing for himself, Mr. Feeney replied with the Gallic proverb, "There are no pockets in a shroud." This means that when we die, we leave all our money on Earth. It is little wonder Mr. Feeney has always wanted to die a poor man, and at 91 years old, it seems he may finally achieve that goal since he now has less than $1 million in the bank. Azim Premji. It is one thing to be cheap for a good cause like Mr. Feeney, but it's another thing entirely to be cheap just because you would like to save some extra money. That is exactly the case for Azim Premji, the owner of Wipro, a technology service giant. Mr. Premji is worth around $5 billion, but if you worked for him, you would think he was on the verge of bankruptcy. He is said to monitor the number of toilet paper rolls used in Wipro facilities, and he tells his employees to switch off the light when they leave their offices, even if it's for a short while. But Mr. Premji does not have these austere expectations for his workers alone. He also has them for himself. For instance, he only flies economy, and his vehicle is an old Ford that is begging to be released from a life of pain and service. He even has the same expectations for his wife, as he only bought a Fiat and then gave her no chauffeur, even though he could probably afford 100. So what does he use his money for? According to his countrymen, Mr. Premji is not too interested in charity, so he does not spend on himself, and he does not spend on charity. Perhaps he just keeps his money in a cave and hires a dragon to stand guard. Okay, for legal purposes, that was a joke. Wang Guanzhou. Before Wang Guanzhou was busted for insider trading, he was China's richest man with an estimated net worth of $7.1 billion. He was also the most frugal billionaire in China and only lived in a small Beijing apartment. He was also said to have no hobbies. Another reason why Mr. Gong Yu was so frugal was that China is a somewhat communist nation, and people are always suspicious of the wealthy and distrust them quickly. Of course, time eventually proved that people were right to think of Mr. Guang Yu as a crook, because that's exactly what he was. Ingvar Kamprad. Whether you have assembled an IKEA table or chair before or not, it's very unlikely that you've never heard of the company. IKEA founder Ingvar Kamprad has made it to the list of billionaires for obvious reasons, but he is also surprisingly celebrated in popular media for being extremely frugal. He was even celebrated on Forbes for driving a 1993 Volvo and dining in cheap restaurants despite his fortune. But people who know Mr. Kamprad know that is far from the truth. Instead of a 1993 Volvo, Mr. Kamprad drives a Porsche and lives in an 18th century Swedish mansion. It appears that the lure of ostentatious living was just too much for good old Mr. Kamprad. Carlos Slim. In 2010, Carlos Slim was ranked the richest man in the world. This was a position he held till he was overtaken by Bill Gates in 2013. Despite being this wealthy, Mr. Slim managed to live a very slim life. For example, he still wears clothes he buys off the rack at his retail stores. These stores are not luxury stores, by the way, and the clothing sold there is targeted at people like you and me. But Mr. Slim does all his shopping there and has zero expensive hobbies. Instead, he spends most of his time with his family. How impressively wholesome. Warren Buffett. You might know him as the Oracle of Omaha. Warren Buffett is undoubtedly one of the most famous and seasoned investors of our time. After you find out how he treats his money, you might be tempted to call him the Oracle of Frugal Living instead. Despite having an incredible net worth of about $97 billion, Buffett still lives in the house he bought for $30,000 60 years ago. He also drives a 2006 Cadillac when he can afford any expensive car he wanted. Perhaps the reason for Buffett's austerity is that he was not very rich as a young person. Interestingly, he only became very wealthy in his 50s. Perhaps the fact that he lived all his young life without billions in the bank made him used to a regular lifestyle. And that's the end of the video. How do these billionaires' cheap lifestyles compare to your lifestyle? Do you think they are indeed cheaper than you? Let us know in the comment section. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel to learn more about investing and building your wealth.